Mark, a writer seeking inspiration, arrives at the legendary Stanley Hotel in the mountains of Colorado. What seemed like the perfect refuge for writing soon turns into a nightmare. Silent hallways, whispers in the dead of night, and an unsettling presence in room 217, the spirit of Elizabeth Wilson, the housekeeper who tragically died there. As the mystery deepens, Mark discovers that the hotel hides much darker secrets. Will he leave unscathed? Find out now here on Deep Fear, Dark Tales. Mark parked his car in the spacious lot of the Stanley Hotel, admiring the imposing architecture that rose against the majestic backdrop of the Estes Park Mountains in Colorado. The building was a relic of the past, with its white towers and large windows, almost as if time had stopped there. He couldn't deny the beauty of the place, but there was an aura of silence, a weight he felt as soon as he got out of the car. Perhaps it was just the isolation or the fatigue from the journey. Mark had chosen the Stanley Hotel for a very specific reason. He needed peace to work on his new novel. The creative block that had plagued him for months tormented him, and he believed that the isolation and the hotel's rich history could help him break this cycle. More than that, he knew the hotel had inspired The Shining, a fact that sparked a fascination he couldn't fully explain. When he entered the lobby, he was greeted by a young, smiling receptionist who quickly handed him the keys to his room. "If you need anything, we're here for you," she said with an almost rehearsed kindness. As Mark walked through the long, beautifully decorated hallways, he couldn't help but feel a slight chill. The silence was nearly deafening, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floor beneath his feet. As he climbed to the second floor, an older guest descending the stairs stopped to look at him. The man, with a hardened and aged expression, murmured in a somber tone, "Avoid room 217, kid. Nothing good happens there." Mark frowned, but before he could ask anything, the man had vanished down the hallway. Curious yet unfazed, Mark reached his room, unpacked his things, and prepared for a quiet night. Despite the strange warning, he was determined to make the most of his time and dive into writing. However, as night fell, an unease began to settle in. The hotel, now in complete silence, seemed more alive than during the day, as if it concealed secrets that couldn't be seen in the sunlight. On the first night, Mark tried to focus on his writing, but the fatigue from his journey quickly overcame him. He fell into a deep sleep, even though the hotel's quiet atmosphere felt somewhat oppressive. However, what was supposed to be a peaceful night's rest quickly turned into something disturbing. At some point in the early morning, he was awakened by a faint sound, soft footsteps in the hallway, right outside his door. At first, Mark ignored it. The hotel was full of other guests, and someone walking down the hallway in the middle of the night wasn't necessarily unusual. But the footsteps continued, irregular and slow, as if the person was stopping and starting again. He turned in bed, trying to go back to sleep, but the sound persisted. With each passing minute, it seemed to grow closer, until he was certain someone was standing right outside his room. Slowly, Mark got up and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found the hallway empty, illuminated only by the dim, yellow lights. There was no sign of anyone. He waited a few seconds, looking in both directions, but everything remained silent. He closed the door, thinking perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks. Still, he felt a discomfort he couldn't explain. On the second night, the strange events intensified. Mark was working on his laptop, struggling with a stubborn paragraph, when he noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped drastically. He got up to adjust the thermostat, but the chill seemed not to come from the surrounding environment. It felt like it was coming from inside him, as if an invisible presence were taking over the space. As he tried to ignore the sensation, he heard a low whisper, too faint to make out words. but close enough to send shivers down his spine. This time, he felt fear settling in. It wasn't just a feeling of discomfort. It was an irrational terror that gripped his body. He looked around, examining the room. All the furniture was in place. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, the air felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't identify. The whisper vanished as suddenly as it had begun. On the third night, the events reached a new level of intensity. Mark was awakened in the middle of the night by a sound that seemed to come from the closet, a slow creak, as if something or someone were trying to open the door. His heart raced, and immediate fear paralyzed him. Lying in bed, he fixed his eyes on the closet door, bracing for the worst. The creaking stopped, but the silence that followed was even more oppressive. Mark couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. His mind was on high alert, and every little noise in the hotel seemed amplified, as if something were stalking him. When dawn finally arrived, he stepped out of the room to breathe the fresh morning air in the mountains. The hotel, in the daylight, appeared ordinary, harmless. But he knew something was there, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. As the day wore on, he began to realize that the events were not mere accidents. With each step through the hallways, he felt a presence around him, as if someone or something were watching him closely. Moreover, his dreams, once muddled and insignificant, were now dominated by the image of a woman he had never seen before. She appeared in the distance, always observing but never approaching. He tried to understand who she was, but her features were vague, as if shrouded in mist. Gradually, Mark began to wonder if the hotel was truly haunted, as the rumors claimed. And more than that, he questioned why the events seemed to be happening specifically to him. Was the hotel trying to communicate? Or was it his own tired and desperate mind creating illusions? One thing, however, was clear. Something was very wrong. In the days that followed, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening at the Stanley Hotel. The paranormal events became constant. Objects vanished from their places only to reappear elsewhere. Lights flickered for no apparent reason, and that cold he had felt before now surrounded him constantly. He was convinced it was not mere coincidence. Each time these events occurred, the image of the woman he saw in his dreams seemed to become clearer. She was always distant, a nebulous figure that merely observed him but never approached. She didn't seem threatening, but the consistency of her presence left him unsettled. It was then that he remembered the warning from the older guest. Avoid room 217. Driven by curiosity and growing discomfort, Mark decided to investigate the history of the room. At the reception, he discreetly asked questions about room 217, but the receptionist merely shook her head and avoided discussing it, as if it were a secret everyone knew but preferred not to talk about. This only heightened Mark's determination. He felt the mystery of the hotel was deeply connected to that specific room. After some quick online research and conversations with local residents, Mark began to uncover fragments of the history of room 217. He read accounts from other guests who had experienced disturbing phenomena while staying in the room. Whispers at night, furniture moving on its own, and most commonly, the presence of a female figure that briefly appeared and then vanished. Everything pointed to the room being the center of paranormal activity in the hotel. It was then that he found the name Elizabeth Wilson, a former housekeeper of the hotel. In 1911, Elizabeth had been the victim of an accidental gas explosion while working in room 217. The official story reported that she survived the accident with severe injuries, but persistent rumors suggested that she had never truly left the hotel. Some claim that since her death, Elizabeth haunted the room where she suffered the accident, tending to it as she had in life. Mark felt a chill as he read the accounts. The figure he saw in his dreams fit Elizabeth's description, a formally dressed woman, always at a distance, as if she were watching over something. He began to connect the dots. Everything in the hotel seemed to revolve around that room, and he knew that if he wanted to understand what was happening, he needed to learn more about Elizabeth's death. Determined to dig deeper, Mark decided to speak with older hotel staff members, hoping they could reveal more details. An elderly janitor who had worked there for decades finally relented and told him more about the local legend. According to him, Elizabeth was a dedicated and perfectionist employee, beloved by guests, but since the accident, her spirit had never found peace. Many believed she still cared for the room, keeping it in order, but punishing those who disrespected it or tried to challenge her. There are places in this hotel that simply don't want to be disturbed, the janitor said with a weary look. Room 217 is one of those places. These words etched themselves in Mark's mind. He felt he was getting closer to the truth, but he also began to recognize the risk he was taking. The hotel had a force of its own, something he still didn't fully understand, and room 217 seemed to be the heart of this mystery. With each new detail uncovered, his desire to see the room increased, even though a part of him knew he might be putting himself in danger. However, Mark was not the type to shy away from a challenge, and now he was determined to confront the secrets the hotel hid. Mark's curiosity had turned into obsession. Despite the dark warnings and disturbing stories surrounding room 217, he knew his quest for answers would only be complete if he confronted the place directly. The housekeeper, Elizabeth Wilson, seemed to be the key to the paranormal events occurring, and Mark felt that the truth about her death and haunting remained hidden. On the following night, he prepared himself. The second-floor hallway was silent as he stepped out of his room. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't describe. As he walked toward room 217, each step seemed to echo exaggeratedly against the walls, as if the hotel were watching his approach. When he finally stood before the door, his heart hammered in his chest. He hesitated for a moment, hand outstretched, before finally gripping the cold doorknob. As he turned it, the door opened easily, as if it had been waiting for him. The room appeared ordinary at first glance, lit only by the faint moonlight streaming through the window. The bed was perfectly made, the furniture in order. There was nothing extraordinary, but Mark felt the same icy presence that had haunted him before. He closed the door behind him and took a few tentative steps inside the room. As soon as his feet touched the floor, the temperature plummeted. It was as if the air around him had been sucked away, leaving only a biting cold. Mark felt his throat dry and a shiver run down his spine. He knew he was not alone there. That's when the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the room like a sentence. Mark ran to the door and tried to open it, but it was useless. It was locked and there was no key. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, a whisper filled the room, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. Mark turned and saw something that made his blood run cold. In the mirror next to the bed, a figure appeared, a woman, her image blurred and distorted by the mist that seemed to emanate from her. It was Elizabeth. She stood beside the bed, her face marked by suffering. Her eyes, which had been distant in his dreams, now stared directly at him. Mark felt an invisible force push him backward, causing him to fall to the floor. He tried to get up, but the weight in the air pressed down on him, as if the very environment were turning against him. Elizabeth didn't move, but her presence was overwhelming. Then, without warning, the room began to change. The walls trembled, and Mark started to hear the distant sound of an explosion, muffled as if it were happening miles away. The noise grew louder until he could hear the roar of fire, and the hissing of escaping gas. He wasn't just hearing it, he was reliving it. The room filled with smoke, the unbearable heat surrounding him. He coughed, panic rising as invisible flames seemed to lick the walls. Elizabeth was living the moment of her death, and Mark was trapped in this nightmare with her. The terror was overwhelming, but amid the chaos, Mark realized that Elizabeth wasn't trying to harm him. She was showing him what had happened. He didn't know how, but it was as if she wanted him to understand her pain. He struggled to get up and shouted to her, "I know what happened to you, Elizabeth." His voice sounded weak amid the chaos. "You don't have to stay here. You can rest." The figure paused, and for a brief moment, the sounds faded. The room returned to its original state. No fire, no smoke, no explosion. But Elizabeth's presence still lingered. She stared at him, and Mark felt there was still something unresolved, something he hadn't fully comprehended. She wasn't ready to leave. Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker violently, and Mark was pushed back again by an invisible force. This time, the blow was stronger, and he slammed against the wall, leaving him dazed. Pain spread through his body, but he fought to get up. The air grew cold again, and Elizabeth approached slowly. Mark was on the brink of panic, but a desperate idea emerged. He tried to communicate once more. "I can help you," he shouted. "Let me help you." There was a moment of absolute silence. Elizabeth stopped, her eyes fixed on Mark as if considering his words. Then, slowly, she began to fade, the mist surrounding her dissipating into the cold air. The door to the room opened by itself, and Mark fell to his knees, breathless. He knew it wasn't over yet. Mark staggered out of room 217, his body still trembling from the confrontation with Elizabeth's presence. His thoughts were jumbled, but one thing was clear. Elizabeth Wilson was trying to tell him something, a secret that remained buried and kept her bound to the hotel. He was now more determined than ever to uncover the truth. However, the events of that night left him shaken. In the following days, he avoided any contact with room 217, spending most of his time in the local library archives and speaking with the few older staff members willing to divulge the hotel's history. One of them, a housekeeper named Karen, agreed to speak with him in secret, away from prying eyes. During a private conversation at a secluded cafe, Karen revealed details Mark had not yet known. Elizabeth was the best employee this hotel ever had, Karen began, nervously stirring her cup of coffee. She was dedicated, but she had enemies. Some people who worked here at the time didn't like her. They thought she knew too much things about the hotel's management, about what happened behind the curtains. Mark leaned forward, attentive to every word. "What do you mean, knew too much?" Karen looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. There were rumors that the hotel was involved in illegal activities, bootlegging during Prohibition and other shady dealings. Elizabeth was too trustworthy for her own good. When the explosion happened in room 217, many of us always believed it wasn't an accident. Maybe she discovered something she shouldn't have. Mark felt the familiar chill rise up his spine. Elizabeth's tragedy seemed more than just a mere misfortune. If what Karen said was true, she could have been silenced. The accident everyone talked about might have been a cover-up, an act to hide something larger. Mark knew there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface of this hotel. After this revelation, he began to delve deeper into the city's historical records. In the library, he found old newspapers and documents that confirmed the rumors of corruption in the hotel during the 1920s. The Stanley, which presented itself as a luxurious refuge for high society, had apparently been the center of illicit activities. There were accounts of suppressed police investigations and employees who mysteriously disappeared, all covered up by the powerful management of the time. These were pieces of a larger puzzle, and the image forming was clear. Elizabeth had discovered something she shouldn't have, and room 217 had been the stage for her punishment. But Mark still couldn't understand why her spirit remained in the hotel. Was it her anger over the injustice, or was something else holding her there? As days passed, Elizabeth's presence grew stronger. Mark began to notice subtle changes in the environment around him, even outside of room 217. He felt her gaze upon him in different parts of the hotel, as if she were following his steps, ensuring he was heading in the right direction. The lights continued to flicker in his room, and the cold still haunted him. But now he sensed that Elizabeth no longer wanted to frighten him. She wanted to be understood. During one of his sleepless nights, Mark dreamed of Elizabeth again, but this time the dream was different. She appeared closer than before, no longer a distant figure. Her eyes seemed to plead for help, and instead of attacking him or trying to scare him, she extended her hand, as if waiting for him to guide her. He woke up with an overwhelming sense of urgency. He knew he was getting closer to an answer. Something told him that Elizabeth needed him to uncover the full truth so she could finally rest. Whatever it was she knew, whatever had kept her bound to the hotel, was connected to the dark secret of her death and what happened in room 217. Driven by this certainty, Mark decided to return to the hotel and continue his investigation there. He sought out other staff members who might be willing to talk, but many refused, claiming Elizabeth's story was a legend no one discussed anymore. However, an older employee, the janitor who had spoken with him previously, provided a new clue. "You won't find the truth in books or archives," the janitor said, with a mysterious look. "The only person who can give you the answers is in room 217 itself. Everything you need to know is there." These words echoed in Mark's mind. The answer was truly in the room, or rather with Elizabeth. He no longer doubted that the key to freeing her spirit lay in the very place where she had died. But that meant he would have to face the room and Elizabeth again. Returning to room 217 would not be easy, but Mark felt that the only way to find peace for himself and for Elizabeth was to unearth the complete truth. The fragments of information he had gathered pointed to something much larger and darker than he had initially imagined. The Stanley Hotel, with all its glamorous and historical facade, was the epicenter of a web of secrets that extended far beyond the death of a housekeeper. Determined to see it through, Mark returned to the hotel that night, resolved to revisit room 217, even if it meant facing Elizabeth's wrath once more. He knew that to solve the mystery he would have to take risks. When he arrived at the second-floor hallway, the atmosphere felt even heavier than the last time. The air was frigid, and the darkness seemed deeper, as if the hotel itself was aware of what he was about to uncover. Mark hesitated briefly in front of the door, recalling the terror of his first entry, but his determination propelled him to turn the doorknob without a second thought. As soon as the door closed behind him, room 217 began to pulse with the same supernatural energy. The cold enveloped the space, and suddenly, Mark saw Elizabeth's figure again. This time, she was clearer, closer, her expression filled with pain, but also expectation. She stared at him as if she knew he held the answers to her suffering. "You were silenced, weren't you?" Mark whispered, barely believing the words he was saying. "You knew something about what was happening here, about the hotel, and you were killed to keep that secret from coming out." The silence in the room was overwhelming, but the lights began to flicker, signaling that he was on the right path. Mark realized that Elizabeth wasn't haunting the place out of vengeance. She wanted the truth to come to light, but couldn't communicate with him directly. Her pain and anger bound her there, but they could also help him understand what really happened on that fateful night. Mark searched the room, trying to find something tangible to corroborate his theory. He knew the hotel had hidden its story of corruption and crime, and Elizabeth's death seemed to be at the center of it. Then he remembered the janitor's words. The only person who can give you the answers is in room 217 itself. What did that mean? He wasn't looking for documents or records. He was there to witness the truth Elizabeth wanted to show him. She didn't want him to uncover the story through old papers. She wanted him to see it with his own eyes. As this understanding took shape in his mind, Mark was again thrown backward by an invisible force. He fell to the floor, feeling an overwhelming presence around him. The room began to tremble, and the sound of the gas explosion echoed in his ears once more. It was as if he were being transported back in time, to the exact moment of Elizabeth's death. The room transformed around him. The walls faded, revealing an older version of the hotel. The environment seemed to revert to a bygone era, and Mark found himself within the scene that led to Elizabeth's death. The smell of gas was strong, mingled with the sound of muffled voices and hurried footsteps. Then he saw Elizabeth alive in her original form, diligently working in the room. But something was wrong. Mark realized that it wasn't just the gas explosion that had killed Elizabeth. He saw shadows in the hallway, suspicious-looking men arguing among themselves. One of them, with a nervous look, approached room 217 and, in a swift motion, tampered with the room's gas system. Elizabeth didn't realize the trap that had been set for her. She continued her work, oblivious to the fact that she was about to be murdered. Mark watched in horror as the scene unfolded. The man fled just before the explosion occurred, but the plan was already in motion. The explosion happened minutes later, destroying the room and killing Elizabeth instantly. But now Mark understood. This was no accident. The explosion was intentional, and Elizabeth was silenced because she knew too much about the crimes happening at the hotel. The truth behind her death was even darker than he had imagined. As the scene concluded, Mark found himself back in the present. Room 217 had returned to its current state, but Elizabeth was still there, her ghostly figure watching him with sadness. She had shown him the truth. She wanted justice. Mark was stunned. He knew that Elizabeth's death had been deliberate, a carefully planned murder. But what would he do now? The revelation of the truth alone wouldn't free Elizabeth. She needed the world to know what happened, for the truth to finally come to light. The weight of that knowledge crushed him, but he knew he had to do something about it. Elizabeth slowly faded, as if aware that her role in that moment was fulfilled. But before she left, she looked at Mark with an expression of gratitude and pleading, a silent last request for him to continue what she couldn't finish. Mark left room 217 with his mind racing. Elizabeth's death had been a brutal murder, part of a larger cover-up involving the hotel itself. Now, he had the responsibility to tell this story, and perhaps finally free Elizabeth's spirit. Mark left room 217, his heart heavy with the revelation of the cover-up. He knew the explosion that killed Elizabeth was no accident, and that the forces behind her death still cast a shadow over the hotel. The problem was that this truth, as dark as it was, didn't seem to be enough to free Elizabeth's spirit. She was still trapped there, and now he felt an almost unbearable responsibility to do something about it. In the following hours, Mark felt Elizabeth's presence stronger than ever. No matter where he was in the hotel, whether in the hallways, the restaurant, or even the parking lot, he sensed Elizabeth by his side, watching him. The chilling fear he had felt before was gone. Now it felt like a constant, silent plea for justice. Determined to end the torment, Mark realized that his only option was to return to room 217 for one last attempt to free her. This time, he didn't need to search for more answers. He already knew what had happened. Now, the question was how to help Elizabeth find peace. When he entered the room for the third time, the atmosphere was different. There was no longer the crushing tension or the cold that had engulfed him during previous visits. Instead, there was an unsettling calmness. Elizabeth was there, her figure clearer, almost solid. She watched him with sad but hopeful eyes, as if she were waiting for him to complete something she could not do herself. Mark approached slowly, feeling no fear this time. "I saw what happened to you, Elizabeth," he said softly, trying to remain calm in the presence of the spectral figure. "I know you were murdered, and they tried to erase it as an accident." Elizabeth didn't respond, but the expression on her face changed. There was something in the sadness of her eyes, as if she knew the truth was finally revealed, but that something was still needed for her to depart. "You don't have to stay here anymore. They killed you because you knew too much, but now your story can be told. I will make sure the world knows what happened," Mark continued, his words filled with genuine promise. For a moment, the room was absolutely still, as if time had stopped. Elizabeth stood there unmoving, her gaze locked on Mark's. He could feel her pain and the weight of the years of injustice that kept her tied to that place. But even with the truth revealed, Mark realized that merely exposing the hotel's secrets wouldn't be enough. Elizabeth needed something deeper, perhaps forgiveness or acknowledgement. "You are not alone anymore," Mark murmured, now certain that he needed to be sincere with the spirit before him. "I saw everything you went through. I won't let this be forgotten, but now you have to let this go. You deserve to rest." Elizabeth stepped forward, her form beginning to slowly fade. Her expression of pain softened, and she looked at Mark with gratitude. In that moment, he knew she was accepting his words. The truth had finally been acknowledged, and she could move on. Elizabeth's figure gradually dissipated until nothing remained but a gentle breeze and silence. The room felt lighter, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. Mark stood in the center of the room, feeling a wave of relief and sadness at the same time. The final confrontation was over, but Elizabeth's story was just beginning to be told. He left room 217 knowing that his work was not finished. Elizabeth's spirit had finally found peace, but the world still needed to know what had really happened in that hotel all those years ago. Mark stepped out of room 217 for the last time, feeling a strange lightness. The tension that had once hovered over the hotel seemed to have dissipated, as if, with Elizabeth's departure, part of the dark energy had also vanished. He walked silently through the hallways, hearing only the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet. There were no more lurking whispers or the constant sensation of being watched. For the first time since arriving at the Stanley Hotel, Mark felt that the place was truly quiet. Still, as he descended the stairs toward the lobby, he couldn't help but wonder if he had fully freed Elizabeth. Even after witnessing her departure, something felt unresolved. Perhaps it was the weight of the secret he now carried, the truth about her death and the crimes the hotel had tried to hide for decades. He knew that bringing these revelations to light was the next step. His mission, however, seemed not just to reveal the story, but also to grapple with the burden she had left behind. When he reached the lobby, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large windows, bathing the space in a soft light. The hotel looked different in daylight, more inviting and less threatening. He walked to the front desk to check out, not intending to return. There was nothing left for him there. As he waited, he observed the other guests. For them, the Stanley Hotel was still just a stop in the mountains, a historic location with charm and luxury. No one suspected what had truly happened there. Lost lives, buried secrets. Mark knew that for most people, the hotel would remain a peaceful refuge. Only he was aware of the horror that had been trapped within its walls for so long. When he finally stepped out of the hotel, Mark breathed in the fresh mountain air and felt a pang of relief. He knew his journey wasn't over. Now, he needed to share Elizabeth's story with the world. However, as he walked toward his car, something made him stop. A reflection in the glass of one of the windows caught his attention. Mark turned slowly and looked up to the second floor, at the window of room 217. For a brief moment he saw something. It was a shadow, an indistinct figure, like a wisp lurking behind the curtain. His blood ran cold. Elizabeth? He blinked, and the shadow disappeared. Perhaps it was just his imagination, the trauma of the past few days playing tricks on his mind. But something told him that the story of the Stanley Hotel was not yet completely finished. With one last glance at the hotel, Mark got into his car and drove away, leaving the hotel behind, but perhaps not its secrets.
If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support is really important to us and motivates us to bring more amazing stories. Thank you for watching.